A mother and son, torn apart by a lifetime of regret and unanswered questions, meet in a moment charged with raw emotion, setting the stage for a journey of redemption, forgiveness, and the fragile hope of reconciliation. "I waited for you." Jaden's voice cracked, his eyes filled with years of pain. Across from him, Rebecca, the mother who had given him up, struggled to breathe under the weight of his words. In her trembling hands, she clutched the truth, a truth that might heal their fractured bond or shatter forever. Their past had been broken, but in this moment, the possibility of a new beginning hung precariously in the balance. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. In a courtroom simmering with tension, divided by invisible lines of race and class, a young black boy stood and declared, "You're my mom." The words detonated like a bomb, silencing every whispered conversation, every shuffle of paper. The crowd, packed shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, froze, their collective breath held in disbelief. What followed would change everything. The courtroom was a battleground that morning. Tension hung heavy, like the still air before a storm. Rows of spectators sat rigid, their eyes flitting between the judge's bench and the defendant's table. On trial was Jaden, a 12-year-old black boy accused of trespassing in a wealthy, gated community. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his small frame swallowed by the oversized chair. He wore a tattered hoodie and jeans that were too long for his legs, his sneakers scuffed and worn. His trembling fingers gripped the table's edge, betraying the fear he fought to hide. Behind the bench sat Judge Rebecca Hart, a woman whose sharp features were as unyielding as her reputation. Known for her no-nonsense demeanor and stern judgments, particularly when it came to juvenile offenders, she exuded an air of authority that made the bravest lawyers falter. Her jet-black robe billowed as she flipped through the case file, her expression cold and detached. The bailiff's voice broke the tension. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Rebecca Hart." The audience rose in unison, their movements stiff and hesitant, the gravity of the moment pinning them down. Rebecca's gaze swept the room, briefly landing on Jaden. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, disapproval, perhaps, crossing her face. "You may be seated," she said, her voice clipped as the shuffling of feet and murmurs subsided. "This case concerns charges of trespassing and loitering. Defendant, you are accused of entering private property without permission. How do you plead?" Jaden's public defender leaned in, whispering hurried words of guidance. The boy hesitated, his wide, tear-glazed eyes darting nervously. His voice, small and shaky, finally broke the silence. "Not guilty," he murmured, barely audible. Rebecca made a note, her face unreadable. "Proceed with opening statements," she said, gesturing to the prosecutor. As the prosecutor began outlining the case, a narrative of alleged trespass and defiance, Jaden's focus shifted. His eyes wandered, scanning the room until they found Rebecca. His breathing quickened. His expression, once filled with fear, softened into something deeper. Recognition. The prosecutor's voice became a blur, drowned out by the roaring in Jaden's ears. Rebecca noticed his stare and frowned. "Defendant, is there something you'd like to say?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Jaden's grip on the table tightened. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence, all eyes on the small boy whose trembling lips struggled to form words. I know you," he blurted, his voice cracking. Rebecca blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Excuse me? You're my mom," Jaden said louder this time, his words echoing like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone whispered, "What did he just say?" Rebecca froze. Her pen hovered midair, her usually stoic face betraying a flicker of shock. She stared at the boy, her gaze sharpening as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "What did you say?" she asked, her voice low, trembling. Tears streamed down Jaden's face as he repeated, "You're my mom." The courtroom erupted into whispers, the energy electric, volatile. Reporters scribbled furiously, their pens scratching out the first lines of what promised to be front-page headlines. Rebecca's hand trembled as she set down her pen. Her carefully constructed composure cracked under the weight of the boy's words. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "You gave me away," Jaden continued, his voice trembling with raw emotion. "My foster mom told me everything." Rebecca's breath hitched. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in, the whispers from the audience growing louder, pressing against her like a tide. She looked at the bailiff, then the prosecutor, both frozen in place. I need a moment," she stammered. The sound of her chair scraping against the polished wood floor echoed as she stood abruptly. "The court will take a short recess," she announced, her voice cracking. In her chambers, Rebecca paced like a caged animal. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her polished facade utterly shattered. Memories she had buried deep clawed their way to the surface. She was 18 again, a scared girl from a small conservative town, staring at a positive pregnancy test. The arguments with her parents echoed in her ears, the shame in their eyes, the crushing weight of their ultimatum. Give the baby up or lose everything. She pressed her hands against the edge of her desk, her knuckles white. For decades, she had locked away that chapter of her life, burying it beneath degrees, accolades, and the authority of her black robe. Yet here it was, laid bare by a boy whose tears mirrored her own youthful pain. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Jaden sat motionless, tears streaking his face. The room buzzed with speculation, but his focus remained on the door through which Rebecca had disappeared. When Rebecca finally returned, the weight of the room seemed to shift. Her steps were slower, her eyes softer, but her voice carried a newfound gravity. She looked at Jaden, not as a defendant, but as a boy she had once held, if only for a fleeting moment. "Jaden," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. I want to hear your story." The room held its breath, the line between judge and mother irrevocably blurred. What followed would not only redefine Rebecca Hart's life, but inspire every person in that courtroom to confront the power of truth, love, and redemption. The courtroom sat in tense silence, the kind of silence that stretches so taut it feels like it might snap. Judge Rebecca Hart stood in her chambers, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of her desk. Outside, the world waited for her return, but inside, she was at war with herself. She had faced countless cases, hardened criminals, and desperate pleas. Yet nothing had prepared her for this moment. "You're my mom." The words echoed in her mind like a haunting refrain. No matter how much she tried to steady herself, the image of Jaden's tear-streaked face lingered, his voice, a mix of pain and defiance, cutting through her composure like a blade. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Judge Hart. Her clerk's voice was cautious, almost apologetic. "The courtroom is waiting." Rebecca straightened, adjusting her robe like armor, willing herself back into the calm, authoritative persona she had spent decades perfecting. She inhaled deeply, smothering the storm raging inside her, and opened the door. The moment she stepped into the courtroom, the murmurs died down, replaced by an oppressive silence. Every pair of eyes was locked on her, dissecting her every move, every breath. She returned to her seat, her movements precise and deliberate. "This court is back in session," she announced, her voice firm but not as steady as it had been before. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched tightly together, his eyes red but defiant. His public defender whispered something to him, but the boy didn't react. His focus remained solely on Rebecca. The prosecutor stood, looking hesitant. "Your Honor, given the unusual circumstances, I believe it's appropriate to address." "That's enough," Rebecca interrupted sharply, her tone biting. We are here to address the charges, not to entertain unfounded claims. But Jaden wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, his small frame trembling with emotion that seemed far too large for him to contain. "It's not a claim," he shouted, his voice cracking. "It's the truth." "Sit down, young man," Rebecca ordered, her voice faltering slightly under the weight of his conviction. "No." Jaden's voice rose, raw and filled with anguish. "You don't get to ignore me. You don't get to pretend I don't exist." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Rebecca's composure cracked further. Her heart pounded as she stared at the boy, his words slicing through years of carefully constructed defenses. "I remember your face," Jaden continued, tears streaming freely now. "My foster mom showed me a picture of you. She said you were scared, that you wanted me to have a better life. But why didn't you come back for me? Why didn't you even try?" The courtroom was deathly silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. Even the reporters, poised with their pens and notepads, seemed to hesitate. Rebecca opened her mouth, but no words came. The walls felt like they were closing in, the room spinning as memories she had buried long ago clawed their way to the surface. She was 18 again, scared and vulnerable, standing in her parents' living room as they told her she had no choice. This isn't the time or place for this discussion," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jaden's lawyer stood, his face pale. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client deserves answers. If there's any truth to his statement, it changes everything about how we proceed." Before Rebecca could respond, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. A woman in her late 40s entered, her kind but weary face immediately drawing attention. Her hesitant steps betrayed her unease, but her presence commanded silence. Jaden turned, his breath catching. "Gloria," he whispered, his voice breaking. Rebecca's heart sank. She recognized the woman instantly. Gloria Adams. The name was etched into her memory, a remnant of a life she had worked so hard to forget. Gloria had been the social worker who facilitated Jaden's adoption, the one who assured her it was the right decision. "Your Honor," Gloria began softly, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's time we all had the truth." Rebecca felt her chest tighten. The truth. The word felt like an anchor dragging her down. Jaden turned back to Rebecca, his eyes pleading. "Please," he said, his voice quiet but insistent. "Just tell me why. That's all I want to know." Rebecca's composure shattered. She looked at Jaden, at Gloria, and then at the sea of curious, judgmental faces staring back at her. She realized there was no escape, no way to shield herself from the truth she had hidden for so long. "Recess," she said, her voice barely audible. She grabbed her gavel, her hand trembling, and banged it against the wooden block. "This court is in recess." She stood quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and fled to her chambers before anyone could stop her. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously. Spectators whispered loudly, and Jaden slumped back into his chair, the weight of rejection crushing him. "I just wanted her to say something," he said to Gloria, his voice barely audible. "Why won't she even talk to me?" Gloria knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been brave enough already, Jaden," she said softly. "She's the one who has to find her courage now." Inside her chambers, Rebecca paced, her mind a whirlwind of memories and emotions. She thought of Jaden's face, the hurt in his eyes, and the words he had spoken, words that had shattered her carefully built world. She sank into her chair, her hands trembling as she buried her face in them. For the first time in years, Judge Rebecca Hart wasn't the composed, unshakable authority figure. She was simply a woman, broken, vulnerable, and haunted by the choices of her past. And outside, in a crowded courtroom filled with whispers and judgment, a boy waited, not for justice, not for absolution, but for a simple answer. Why? Gloria had no answer. She had spent decades guiding children through the labyrinth of the foster system, But Jaden's case had always lingered in her mind like an unresolved shadow. She had watched him bounce between homes, waiting for someone to claim him, to love him, to offer him stability. And now, here he was, sitting in a courtroom, facing the one person who could answer his lifelong questions, only to be met with silence. Meanwhile, Rebecca Hart paced the confines of her chambers, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest like an anvil. Her usually steady hands trembled as she tried to compose herself. But nothing could erase the image of Jaden's face, his trembling voice, his tearful plea. This was no longer about her reputation, her career, or the fragile facade she had built over decades. This was about him. Her steps faltered as she reached her desk. Slowly, she opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn, frayed from years of being tucked away. She stared at the image, a newborn baby swaddled in a faded yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched up in sleep. Her fingers traced the outline of the photo, tears stinging her eyes. She had convinced herself for years that she'd made the right choice. She was just a terrified teenager back then, barely old enough to make decisions about her own life, let alone someone else's. Her parents had insisted she give up the baby. "You will ruin your future," her father had said, his voice firm and unyielding. "He'll have a better life with another family," her mother had assured her, trying to mask her own discomfort. But as the years passed, the memory of that tiny baby never faded. She had often wondered, was he happy? Was he loved? Did he think about her, the woman who had let him go? And now, all those questions had taken the form of a boy named Jaden, standing in her courtroom, shattering the walls she had so carefully built. Her breath caught in her throat as a soft knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. "Judge Hart." Gloria's voice was calm but firm. "May I come in?" Rebecca hesitated. She glanced down at the photograph, then quickly shoved it back into the drawer. Wiping her eyes, she adjusted her robe and cleared her throat. "Come in." The door opened, and Gloria stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her. Her gaze was steady, filled with a kind of knowing that made Rebecca feel even more exposed. "You don't have to say anything," Gloria began, her voice gentle. "But you should know, that boy out there, he's hurting. He's been through more than any child should ever have to endure." Rebecca pressed her lips into a thin line. "I'm aware of the situation," she said curtly. "No," Gloria countered, her tone soft but unyielding. "You're not. Jaden's been in the system his whole life. He's been let down by every adult he ever trusted. And now, he's standing in front of the one person he's dreamed of finding, only to feel like he's being abandoned all over again." Rebecca flinched, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She turned away, unable to meet Gloria's gaze. "It was a long time ago," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's not over," Gloria said, stepping closer. "You have a chance now to give Jaden something he's been searching for his entire life. A sense of belonging, a connection, the truth." Rebecca sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands. Her voice trembled when she finally spoke. "I don't know how to face him," she admitted. "What could I possibly say to make up for everything he's been through?" Gloria placed a reassuring hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "It's not about saying the perfect thing. It's about being honest. Jaden doesn't need excuses or apologies. He just needs to know you care." For a long moment, the room was silent. Then, Rebecca took a shaky breath and nodded. "I need a moment," she said. Gloria gave her a small, understanding smile and stepped out of the chambers. Back in the courtroom, Jaden sat quietly, his head bowed. His hands fidgeted in his lap, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. Gloria approached and crouched down to meet his gaze. "She's not perfect, Jaden," she said gently. "She's scared, just like you. But I think she's starting to understand how much you need her." Jaden's lip quivered. He nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes. "I just want her to tell me why," he whispered, his voice breaking. The doors to the chambers opened, and Rebecca emerged. Her expression was unreadable, but her steps were steady as she walked back to the bench. She glanced at Jaden briefly before addressing the courtroom. "This court is here to address legal matters," she began, her voice even but tinged with emotion. "But I realize now that there is something far more important at stake." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Jaden, I owe you the truth. If you'll allow me, I'd like to speak with you privately." The courtroom erupted into whispers, but Rebecca silenced them with a single raised hand. "This is not a spectacle," she said firmly. "This is a personal matter, and I ask for your respect." Jaden stared at her, his wide eyes full of a fragile hope. Slowly, he nodded. The conference room was small and stark, its white walls amplifying the tension that filled the space. A single table sat in the center, flanked by 2 chairs. Rebecca and Jaden entered, the door clicking shut behind them. Rebecca hesitated by the door, gripping the handle as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Jaden sat down first, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself, the defiance he had shown earlier replaced by vulnerability. "You can sit down," Jaden said quietly, his voice cracking. Rebecca nodded stiffly and lowered herself into the chair. She clasped her hands in front of her, her fingers trembling slightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rebecca broke the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried years of unspoken regret. "I was scared," she began, her eyes meeting his. "And I thought I was doing the right thing. But I've thought about you every single day since then, Jaden. Not a day has gone by that I haven't wondered if you were okay, if you were happy, if you were loved." Jaden's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to know why," he whispered. Rebecca reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it over his. "I was wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was giving you a better life, but I see now that I abandoned you. And I am so sorry." For the first time, Jaden didn't pull away. The walls between them began to crumble, and in that moment, amidst the pain and the tears, there was a glimmer of something neither of them had felt in a long time. Hope. The courtroom felt oppressively silent, the kind of silence that weighs heavy on the soul. Rebecca Hart, usually so composed in her judge's robe, now sat behind her desk, every inch of her unraveling. Her fingers trembled as she traced the edges of an old photograph, its corners frayed from years of being hidden away. It showed a newborn baby swaddled in a soft yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched up in innocent slumber. She couldn't stop the tears that blurred the image, making it ripple like a reflection in troubled water. Memories of that fateful day flooded her mind like a dam breaking. She was just 18 then, barely more than a child herself, sitting in a sterile office with her parents flanking her. Their voices echoed in her memory. "You'll ruin your future if you keep him. He'll have a better life with someone else." Rebecca had believed them, or at least, she let herself believe it, too scared to face the weight of motherhood alone. But the years hadn't dulled the ache of that decision. Not a single day had passed when she didn't wonder about the boy she gave up, the life he had lived, the kind of man he had become. And now, there he was, Jaden, standing in her courtroom, no longer a baby, no longer a boy, but a young man brimming with the anger and sorrow of a lifetime spent waiting for someone who never came. A knock at the door pulled Rebecca from her thoughts. She hastily shoved the photograph back into the drawer and wiped at her tear-streaked cheeks. Her voice was steady, though barely. "Come in, Gloria." The court-appointed social worker who had been a fixture in Jaden's life entered quietly, closing the door behind her. Her presence was a balm of calm amid the storm swirling inside Rebecca. "You don't have to say anything," Gloria began gently, her eyes soft but penetrating. "But you should know, that boy out there, he's been through hell, and he's looking at you, hoping you'll give him something no one else ever has. Answers." Rebecca's jaw tightened. "I'm aware of his situation." "No, you're not," Gloria said, her tone firm but not unkind. He's been let down by everyone who was supposed to protect him. He's been shuffled from one home to the next, clinging to the hope that one day someone would choose him. And now, the one person who could give him the truth is hiding in here, scared to face him. Rebecca's composure cracked like thin ice. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I don't know what to say. What could I possibly say to make up for all of this?" Gloria stepped closer, placing a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "It's not about saying the perfect thing. It's about being honest. Jaden doesn't need excuses. He's heard enough of those. He needs to know you care." Rebecca nodded, her throat too tight to speak. When Gloria left the room, she was left alone with the crushing weight of her regrets. Jaden sat in the courtroom, his head bowed, fingers nervously tapping against the wooden bench. He had tried to keep his walls up, the anger and defiance that had shielded him for years. But now, the cracks were showing. He didn't know what to expect from this woman who had given him away and never looked back. Part of him wanted to hate her, but a larger part, the part he barely acknowledged, just wanted to understand. When Rebecca finally stepped into the room, her steps were slow and tentative. She paused at the bench, her eyes meeting his for the first time. For a moment, she saw not the angry young man before her, but the baby she had held all those years ago. "Jaden," she said softly, her voice trembling, "if you're willing, I'd like to speak with you." Privately, Jaden hesitated. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he nodded. The conference room was small, almost suffocating in its stark simplicity. Rebecca and Jaden sat across from each other, the distance between them feeling both too close and too vast. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Jaden broke the silence, his voice trembling but resolute. "Why did you give me away?" Rebecca flinched as if the words were a physical blow. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I was young," she began, her voice raw. "I was scared. My parents, they told me it was the right thing to do. They said you'd have a better life, with a family who could give you everything I couldn't." Jaden's jaw tightened, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Better," he repeated bitterly. "You thought foster care was better? Being shuffled from one house to another, never knowing if anyone would ever want me. That's what you thought was better." Rebecca's tears spilled over as she whispered, "I didn't know. I thought you'd be adopted. I thought you'd have a family. I didn't know you'd be left in the system. And I was too much of a coward to check." Jaden's hands clenched into fists. "Do you know what it's like to wait for someone who never comes? Every new home, I thought maybe, this is where you'll find me. But you never did." Rebecca couldn't hold back her sobs any longer. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, Jaden. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I failed you. I failed you in every way that matters." Jaden stared at her, his anger slowly giving way to something more fragile. "Do you even care now? Or am I just another mistake you want to forget?" Rebecca reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it palm up in front of him. "You were never a mistake," she said, her voice firm despite the tears. "Not for 1 second. I've thought about you every day of my life, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want to try to be here for you now. If you'll let me." Jaden stared at her hand, his own hesitating. Slowly, cautiously, he placed his hand over hers. I don't know if it's enough," he said quietly. "It's a start," Rebecca replied, her voice filled with hope for the first time in years. When they emerged from the conference room, the courtroom was nearly empty. Gloria was waiting near the bench, her expression a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. Rebecca and Jaden walked out side by side, not as mother and son, but as two people trying to rebuild what had been broken. Gloria approached them. "How did it go?" she asked gently. Jaden glanced at Rebecca, then back at Gloria. "We talked," he said simply. "She told me the truth." Rebecca met Gloria's gaze, her voice steadier now. "I'm not going to walk away this time. I want to do better. For him." Gloria smiled. It's going to take time. But if you're willing, you'll figure it out. Rebecca turned to Jaden, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. I don't expect you to trust me right away, she said softly. But I'll be here. Whatever you need, I'll be here. Jaden's lip quivered. I don't know if I'm ready, he admitted. That's okay, Rebecca said, her voice gentle but firm. We'll take it one step at a time. For the first time, Jaden allowed himself a small, tentative smile. I want to try, he said. I want to know who you really are. Rebecca's heart swelled, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Then we'll figure it out together, she said. And in that fragile moment, amid the uncertainty and pain, a flicker of hope ignited. A chance for healing, for connection, for love. It wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of something new. Something worth fighting for. The hum of the city surrounded the park where Rebecca and Jaden sat side by side on a weathered bench. The early autumn breeze carrying with it the scent of falling leaves and distant laughter. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a fragile silence that had grown familiar in the weeks since they had started meeting. At first, their conversations had been awkward, filled with long pauses and hesitant words. Jaden, guarded and unsure, had only offered fragments of his life. But with time, the walls he had built began to crack. Piece by piece, he shared stories about the foster homes that shaped him, the fleeting friendships that gave him hope, and the dreams he barely dared to voice. He spoke of nights spent staring at the stars, wondering if his mother, somewhere, was doing the same. Rebecca listened intently, her heart breaking with every detail. She could see the boy he once was in the man he was becoming. A boy who had faced a lifetime of disappointment, but still held on to a spark of resilience. In return, she began to open up, telling him about the young girl she used to be. She shared stories of her strict upbringing, her struggles to find her identity, and the relentless climb to becoming a judge, all while carrying the silent burden of the son she had left behind. One crisp afternoon, as golden leaves scattered around them, Jaden broke the gentle rhythm of their conversation with a question that had lingered unspoken for weeks. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you kept me?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. Rebecca drew in a deep, shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked at him, her eyes heavy with years of regret. "Every single day," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't change what I did back then. All I can do is try to make things right now." Jaden nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The sunlight caught the edge of his profile, highlighting the quiet conflict etched into his face. "I'm still mad sometimes," he said after a pause. Rebecca nodded, her expression soft. "That's okay. You're allowed to be mad. I just hope someday you'll let me earn your forgiveness." Jaden turned to her, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, tender moment. "Maybe," he said quietly. It wasn't an immediate breakthrough, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Rebecca had learned, were sometimes the most difficult part. Their relationship didn't change overnight. It grew slowly, like a seed planted in rocky soil. Rebecca made efforts that surprised even herself. One afternoon, she showed up unannounced at the youth center where Jaden spent much of his time. She watched from the sidelines as he played basketball with his friends, her presence drawing curious glances from the other kids. When Jaden spotted her, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "What are you doing here?" he asked, jogging over during a break in the game. Rebecca smiled sheepishly. "I wanted to see you play." "You're not exactly subtle," he muttered, though the hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his lips. When she cheered after his perfect shot later, he couldn't help but glance her way, a flicker of pride lighting up his face. Rebecca also sought guidance from Gloria, determined to support Jaden in ways that truly mattered. Together, they researched therapy options, explored programs to help Jaden build confidence, and attended community events to better understand the world he had grown up in. Rebecca was relentless in her efforts, though there were moments of doubt. Times when old wounds reopened, when the enormity of her past mistakes threatened to overwhelm her. But every time she faltered, she remembered that moment in the conference room when Jaden had placed his hand over hers, signaling the fragile start of trust. That memory kept her moving forward. Months later, the courtroom where Rebecca and Jaden had first met looked entirely different. The once sterile space now buzzed with warmth and anticipation. A small gathering of friends, Gloria, and a few courthouse staff members filled the seats, their faces glowing with quiet joy. Jaden stood beside Rebecca, his posture still hesitant, but no longer weighed down by the same bitterness that had consumed him before. The judge presiding over the event smiled warmly as she addressed the room. Today, we celebrate a new chapter. Rebecca Hart has formally petitioned to take legal guardianship of Jaden Williams, and both parties have agreed to move forward together. Applause broke out, but for Jaden and Rebecca, the noise seemed to fade into the background. Rebecca turned to Jaden, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as she leaned down to meet his eyes. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. Jaden looked up at her, a small, genuine smile breaking across his face. "I think we're going to be okay," he said quietly. Rebecca nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "So do I." As they left the courtroom together, hand in hand, the weight of the past felt different. Not an anchor dragging them down, but a foundation they could build upon. The years they had lost would never return, but they no longer loomed like a shadow over their future. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt the warmth of hope blooming in her chest, stronger than fear, guiding them forward into the unknown. And for Jaden, the mother he had waited for his entire life was finally here. Not perfect, not infallible, but willing to fight for him. And together, they stepped into a future that held something neither had dared to believe in: possibility.